Hello, young historians, and we're back for the second part of our pre-Columbian Americas presentation. We finished with the Mesoamerican region and some short statement about the first immigrants onto the American continent, and then I was turning to the North American region prior to the European invasion. I have this titled Eve of the European Invasion because we do know some about these tribes, hunting, agriculture, building habits, particularly in the Southwest, as you see here, but more about them right when the Europeans show up, because obviously the Europeans come with a culture in which they are writing, they have a scientific interest as well in studying Native American tribes, etc. And in the North American continent, in contrast to the Mesoamerican region, there is not a written culture. So we don't have any pre-European or pre-Columbian writing from the North American continent. But here you can see the archaeological site known as Mesa Verde that is an Anasazi settlement and a cliff dwelling, and we will get to those cliff dwellings in a second. We're going to look at four regions of the North American continent. The Southwest, as you see here, the Anasazi are a big story because we have archaeological remains of them and a mysterious migration of the Anasazi, and we'll talk about that. That's the Southwest. We'll turn then to the Northwest and the Northwest and the Plains Indians, those two different regions in which we have lots of different Indian tribes, but some commonality of culture in both places, and then finally to the Northeast in the United States. So that's where this lecture is headed as the second part of pre-Columbian Americas. Yes, the first site that I want to look at is just the trading site that sits in central part of what is today the United States underneath the city of St. Louis. This site that is known as Cahokia, an artist here has drawn what they think the settlement looked like, a 6-mile wall. You can see it's sort of in the shape of a quasi-square, I don't know, a little half of a rice. I don't know how you want to describe that. But anyways, that's a 6-mile perimeter, a very large mound at the western end of it, and then some smaller mounds, and then the artist has put in settlements or houses that are much more temporary, both in and outside the walled structure. They think that because this Cahokia was on the Mississippi and more or less at the confluence of the Missouri, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers, that it was used as a trading spot. And so the people on the outside were probably some of them farmers, but also people that came in temporarily to partake in trade coming down and up the rivers. Cahokia is at its height in 1100 AD, so it was just some 300 years and more prior to European settlement. Again, it's on the Mississippi River, so a wonderful navigable river in the United States, and today splits the United States in half. They think that the population at times grew to about 25,000. This settlement has the largest population of any North American settlement. But you can see how much smaller it was than both the Aztec and even the Mayan, who were settling at about 75,000 per city-state. It is a crossroads, as we said, since it is on a navigable river. It's a crossroads of trade, so trade came up and down all three of the rivers, and this was an excellent point for setting up a city, and it still is today, which is why St. Louis is one of our major cities in the United States. And so trade came up and down throughout the Americas. There's a big emphasis in the literature today on just the extent to which the Native Americans traded, because we tended to think of them as all separate, tribal, small, and not really interconnected. And Cahokia shows us that the American continent was interconnected. If there was something that was not quite as interconnected, it was the west side of the Rockies, and so the California where you are today and the tribes in California seem to not have had as much, or as far as we can tell, any contact with the tribes that were in the southwest and all the way to the east on the other side of the Rockies. All right, so the Anasazi in the southwest, we said, are the interesting story. There are other tribes, obviously, that you could talk about, and even earlier ones. The Anasazi are famous for the pottery, as you see at the top here on the right-hand side, and then the settlements that they built out of adobe. They were at their height in the Pueblo region. As you see, this Chaco Canyon is a Pueblo settlement from about 900 to 1100 AD. They will suffer a crisis in about 1250 and move to cliff houses. But otherwise, there were Pueblos that grew up in New Mexico, northern New Mexico region, and in Arizona as well, right? And adobe housing. This one, Chaco Canyon, is built on, is a half circle, and it's got an exactly straight edge that marks where both the summer and the winter equinox takes place, when the sun turns to come back after the winter, or at the beginning of the winter, and when the summer solstice starts as well. So they probably kept the time of the year because they were agriculture. They did practice, use irrigation, as civilizations before them in the region had. So we do have evidence of irrigation all the way back to about 100 AD. There were previous civilizations. So this is a Pueblo settlement, and you can see a distinctive feature about the Pueblo settlement that marks it as Anasazi is the circular room here, and there appears to have been other circular rooms. So that will be called the kiva, and we're unsure of its use, but they seem to have built those circular rooms. And again, this is a Pueblo, right? You can see it's very low on the landscape, open relatively. I know they do have it walled, but nonetheless it's open to the region around it. And they practiced irrigation, as I said, and then you can see the pottery on the upper left. We have lots of Anasazi pottery, and so we have it even, we have design, color, and the nature of the look of the pottery will set it to distinctive periods in which the Anasazi were producing certain types. So that's why we can have a date from 1070 to 1180, about a 100-year period in which we think that the pottery on the upper right was created, because that is of the particular design and color and even material that was characteristic of that period. And so that's how they date Anasazi pottery, and that requires that they have lots of pottery from the civilization. They also traded quite broadly. We have excavation sites that tell us that they were trading with the Gulf Coast. There are seashells from the Gulf Coast that were found in these Pueblo settlements. They did other trade as well, obviously, but that's one of the bits of evidence for you guys. Now the mystery is why these Anasazi left those open pueblos, or those lowland pueblos, and came to these cliff houses. And the guesses are two broad ones: that there was a terrible drought that took place and that forced them to go north, because these cliff houses are north in the southern Colorado, Nevada, and northern Arizona region. So drought occurred at the time of about 1200, and also enemies, because they did go to these cliff houses, and cliff houses by their nature are defensive looking settlements because they sit at the top of cliffs. This Mesa Verde settlement, which is a national park today, you can't see it, but right below the central part of it, my pointer's at the central part of it, it is this relatively steep hillside. The current excavation at Mesa Verde is down in the front part of that hillside, where they seem to have thrown a lot of their trash. And trash is a boon for any sort of archaeological excavation, because it tells you a lot about people. Anyways, they moved to these cliff dwellings. Either they had enemies that chased them out of the pueblos and they were trying to find safe places, or drought forced them more to the north, since the southwest region could suffer terribly if you had drought conditions. Mesa Verde itself has 220 rooms. They think the settlement held over 200, maybe 250 people. They have 23 kiva in this settlement. You only see part of the settlement here, the central part of the settlement. There are other houses built along the cliff and other parts of this national park. The kiva, they think, was used for religious purposes. It is a circular hole in the ground. It has a fire pit in the middle. It has benches around the edge of it. And then they built over with wood slats up and then wood slats across the top. And this would have created a very smoky room, even with a hole in the wood slats at the top. So they think that the smoke-filled room and the fire pit and the circuit was used in some way for religious celebrations. At least that's the best guess. I know today we might think, well, maybe it was health, and maybe it was, may well have been medical, right? That somebody may have needed to be in a kiva for, at least according to their medical, that for smoke inhalation of some sort of something that was deemed to be healthy for them to inhale. Anyway, hard to know what they are for, but religious purposes is the best guess. They live in these settlements from about 1250 to 1300, and then they move out. And they think, to the southwest, but we lose the story of the Anasazi about that time. You can see they built up their adobe houses. This one right here is about 3 stories up. They used wood as scaffolding, and then mud brick, sun-dried mud brick. And probably 3 stories is about as high as you can get. They also, you can see these cracks in the rock up here. They put in little storage areas, so they found places where they had stored wheat and it was still in its place. All right, so that's the Anasazi. In the Northwest, we have 2 types of people, and then they lived in small family, usually, tribes. So very small tribes of 25 to 30 people, maybe 35 people, right? Eskimo and Inuit are the 2 types of people in the north and the northwest. The Eskimo tend to be a little bit more to the west. The Inuit inhabit northern, especially up in the Canada region, all the way to pretty close to the east coast. So the Inuit people were broad spread, if in very small and family settlements. A couple of the tribal names in the United States, because they come from Alaska all the way down into your current state of Washington and Oregon as well, are Chinook and Tillamook. Those are tribal names, and you guys know them because we have Chinook salmon, so we've named salmon, which was their big food source, or one of their big food sources, after the Indian tribes. Tillamook was taken on by a company, and we have cheese that comes from Tillamook. One of the distinctive features of the Pacific Northwest tribes is that they use totem poles, and the totem pole marked a settlement. It's kind of, I always say, kind of like a mailbox, only more important than a mailbox. I mean, you put a totem pole out there, and that said, "This is our settlement," right? And you had sculpted into that tree trunk, basically, pictures or representations of gods, and they think too of ancestors, and that the totem pole was used to record historical things and religious things for these small tribes. But it was also a very distinctive marker for your settlement, right? It would tell what sort of tribe lived there, and here you can see a totem is a modern totem pole, but nonetheless a totem pole. The earliest totem pole that we have today, because these things obviously could decay, and they did, is 1850s, is the earliest that you can find any totem pole. So we don't have totem poles, in other words, from pre-Columbian tribes in the Pacific Northwest. They used the dog as a beast of burden of sorts, so they traveled by dog sled and then along the coast by canoes and dug out from usually redwood trees, right? Here's a picture of a modern dog sled and the dog team that's taking it along, but that's how they curried, or they moved moved anywhere they wanted to go, right? Transportation. One of the big sources of food was salmon, of course, and so they were big salmon hunters in the Pacific Ocean and the rivers that went into the Pacific Ocean. They lived in pit houses more than igloos. So a pit house was a kind of like the kiva. It was half dug in to the ground and then, to about waist deep or a little bit shorter, and then they put wood slats up and wood slats over, bark and or wood slats. And that's how the pit houses were built. Plains Indians. Tell me what you think is wrong with this picture if I'm talking about pre-Columbian Plain Indians. And I know you'll tell me, get those horses out of there because the horses come with the Europeans. And that's true, right? So these Indians, if they were pre-Columbian, would have been on foot. Be very hard for us to have a photograph of that since 19th century starts photography. Many tribes in the plains. Obviously, this is a vast area. Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, Arapaho, and we could keep going on. Lots of Plains Indian tribes. They're on foot. They're believed to be both sedentary at times and migratory when they were following herds of bison, usually. So the buffalo were the animal that they relied on for much of their health and for its skin so that they could keep themselves warm. They practiced agriculture when they were settled. So the usual migration was winter one place, summer another place. So winter in the south, summer in the north. And then they would practice agriculture, so they had some crops. They were the ones that came into and made use of Cahokia, bringing goods of trade from the northwest and sometimes from the Texan Pueblo region of New Mexico. And then they would have traded in Cahokia with people from the eastern region. Which brings me to the northeast. Here you have a picture of what is a longhouse. And they recreated this picture here. The broader picture is somebody who's tried to, by models, recreate what the longhouse settlement looked like. Two tribes that shared this culture, or shared certain facets of this culture, especially this longhouse organization. The Algonquin group of natives, and many tribes, once again, in the Algonquin, they tended to be more or less in Canada, to some extent the northeastern United States, and then who the Europeans that settled the United States ran into, which are the Iroquois Federation. And the Iroquois Federation was a federation of 5 different tribes. So I don't expect people to remember the 5 different tribes, but you want to know that there were 5 tribes, and we call them a federation because they had a council that made agreements on things for all of these tribes. And they're known as a council of elders, and a constitution, they call it the Iroquois Constitution, was how they operated. And it was a spoken constitution apparently until the 18th century when it was written down after the Europeans showed up. So you guys can always go have a look at the Iroquois Constitution to sort of see how the Iroquois Federation was agreed to. It's a tough document to work with because it does get written down when the Europeans are there, and they have sort of preconceived notions of governance and government, and so use some of their own words for governance. But I think in general, the whole idea that they had a council of elders and that they got together to make agreements on how these tribes would live together, etc., does show that they had an extensive federation. We consider that the most sophisticated political orientation of the North American tribes. So be sure to distinguish that from Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica obviously has a very sophisticated political organization. The Maya city-states we kind of guess at. The Aztecs we don't. They were running an empire, and they had an extensive city. All of that takes a lot of political organization. And this Iroquois Federation then comes on after that, but is more sophisticated than just simply tribal. I think that's the point, right? So you have 5 tribes, Council of Elders, and this Council of Elders is trying to set rules of how these tribes deal with each other. And the Council of Elders would have 49 chiefs from all, I don't know if it was all, but it was the main tribes in the region. They were animists, and they had shaman, and so the image of the shaman comes from the Iroquois Federation, or at least when we look at the Americas. And the shaman was a priest doctor. So you went to the shaman if you had, a medical condition you wanted treated in this day and age. And the shaman had powers where he could tell you, practical solutions for your problem, probably to some extent, but also he could commune with the gods or the nature and its divine entities in nature, and sort of shape the forces and help you out in that fashion. So a shaman is a doctor and a priest at the same time. And these people were animists. They believed that spirits dwelled in natural things. So the shaman would be evoking spirits in the forest, spirits in the rock, spirits in the sky, spirits in the sun, right? So those are where all the spirits were. They had a currency system. Cowrie shells were shells from the sea that were collected, and they were used as a currency. So you could buy and sell things with cowrie shells. And they built longhouses. And here you can see the longhouse. It's got a scaffolding structure. It's got a poles that are used to hold the structure up. And then it's got grass and bark that is put along the sides to cover the top. If you look at the model a picture's been taken of, you can see at the top that there are holes, if I can get my pointer up here, in the top here, and they split. Every segment was split, and these could be up to 200 feet long, and they had holes at various points in the longhouse, where they had fires below these openings. And they think that families lived in each segment of the house. So this first segment would have a hole, and it would stop, and there would be a family that lived here. And then the next segment would have a hole, a fire pit, and a family would live there. So the long house held lots of families. Some of these houses went up to 200 feet long. That's 2/3 of a football field. They practiced slash and burn. So there's a brilliant book written about how the natives transformed the landscape, Oh, what was that name of that book? Anyways, through slash and burn agriculture. So the lands in the northeast are not very fertile, but if you burn down part of the deciduous forest and a couple of acres, you can get 2 or 3 good years out of it, maybe 4, and then you move on to the next couple of acres that are right next to it and slash and burn, and you get nitrogen into the soil, and then you plant for 2 or 3 years you've got a fertile ground to work on. But that was how the Indians learned to practice agriculture in the region of the Pacific Northwest. Changes in the Land is the name of the book that is about Native Americans pre-Columbian and their agricultural practices and how they altered the landscape by their own agricultural practices. And it's a great book. All right, so last topic here, those are the tribes. Just very quickly, North American diet, the things that we get from North America, some very excellent staple crops, right? Oh, and you guys can have a look at this. Which of the crops is not indigenous to North America? Maize, obviously, is corn. Beans, tomatoes, and squash. Right? And here you want to note I've said North America. So all of these things are American, right? So we have corn, beans, tomato, squash coming from the Americas, and it would go into the New World and it would be very useful. But which one of these is not North American? I hope you guys are looking at that and saying number 3, right? Tomatoes. Tomatoes came from the South American and the Central American region. Otherwise, the North American region had corn, they had maize, they had beans, and they had squash, but no tomatoes. Okay. All right, so that's the end of all the pre-Columbian. Very quickly, right? Obviously, a rhetorical question here, because who discovered America? Asians of some sort obviously discovered America. The most advanced civilizations were in Mesoamerica or Central America. They all practiced they had varied agricultural practices throughout the region, right? So Mesoamerica, we have the use of agriculture as in the Southwest. In the Northeast, we have as well agriculture, but it's a slash and burn agriculture. We have the Plains Indians who practice planting crops as well as migrating, right? And so we got a varied approaches to the land, if we're going to use the term changes in the land as our starting point. They traded extensively from the northwest, northeast, all the way down into Cahokia, Plains Indians, probably connecting up these regions, and from the southeast all the way over to the southwest and the Pueblo civilization. So the extensive trade networks, and then finally architecture, mostly for the North American continent we have in the southwest. If you want to get extensive archaeological remains, we all know that you need to go to Mesoamerica and look at the Mayan, Aztec, Toltec. There's other civilizations that were building cities on a grid, temples, colonnades, extensive palaces and residences. Anyways, that's the Mesoamerican region. The only thing that leaves us extensive archaeological or architectural remains is the southwest of the United States today, the Anasazi. And they were both defensive and aggressive, right? So with the Anasazi, we see a people that seem to have been highly defensive, and even though the record is not absolute, right? They seem to have, at least when they went to the cliff houses, to have developed a pretty defensive position. Right. We do know also that they're aggressive and fighting between Native Americans, which sometimes we tend to just not see, right? That their old vision was they're independent tribes living off the land, and nobody really talked too much about how they might have fought amongst each other. For you guys, I've said the Comanche and the Apache were aggressive, and they may have been the reason that the Anasazi went into the cliff houses, perhaps. All right.